So this is the third part of the Sam Student Handout review for MLA style, and I'm going to pull up and continue to go through and show the Sam Student information. We're going to pick up where we left off on the last video. So if you missed a portion, make sure you go back and look at that on previous videos that are available in this course. And we're going to pick up with, we talked about signal phrases last time, so we're going to pick up with a checklist for writing an essay and just some basics that you get in other places as well, but this is a good area to sort of put everything together. So checklist for writing an essay. Don't begin your conclusion paragraph with the words "in conclusion." It's also best to avoid phrases like "to summarize" or "in summary." It's obvious that it's your conclusion since it's the last paragraph in your paper. Also, don't refer to your paper in your paper. So avoid sentences that start with things like, "in this paper I'm going to tell you about," because that phrasing has just broken several rules. It's referring to your paper in your paper. It uses I, which isn't appropriate in most formal essays, and it uses you, which is second person, and that's also not appropriate in most formal essays. Or this essay will focus on, or this paper will attempt to prove. Don't refer to your paper in your paper. Give your paper an original title. So for example, if you're writing about a piece of literature, you can't name your paper the same as the name of the piece of literature. So for example, if you were writing about the epic poem Beowulf, you can't title your paper Beowulf. If you're writing about the short story A Worn Path, you can't title your paper A Worn Path. You can talk about something specific from A Worn Path. So there are some examples of titles, and notice that the titles of the short stories used in these titles are put in quotation marks, and they're formatted and capitalized as titles. The title of the piece of literature that's long enough to be a book by itself is italicized. So those are correct as far as formatting goes. When you're writing about literature, which happens in English 101 in the literary analysis paper, use present tense verbs when you're writing about things that occur within the work of literature. Say, for example, you would write, "the theme of the story is obvious," instead of "the theme of the story was obvious." Or early in the story, the narrator notes instead of the narrator noted. So we call that the historical present, and it's a construct that we use when we write about literature. Avoid using too many quotations. We've talked about that in a previous recording. My limit is 20% of your overall essay. Other instructors may have various limits, but I do want you to use proof quotations, especially when you're writing about a piece of literature. Now, if you're not writing about a piece of literature, you may not need to use many quotations, because you may only use a quotation if there's not another good way to state something that captures the true meaning or feeling of what you're borrowing from that particular author. When you're writing about a work of literature, use proof quotations to serve as examples. I mentioned that previously as well. Avoid using first person and second person in most formal essays. When writing about literature, you put titles of short stories, articles, and poems in quotation marks. Titles of things that stand alone as books, like plays, magazines, or that can stand alone. They don't have necessarily to be books. Plays, magazines, newspapers, books, journals, even television programs are italicized. Names of movies are italicized. Check for punctuation errors. When you're writing a formal essay, avoid starting sentences with what we call coordinating conjunctions, because they're typically connectors that are connecting a clause to another clause. So don't start a sentence with but or and when writing a formal essay. Avoid ending sentences with prepositions. Instead of saying, for example, "where are you going to?" just say, "where are you going?" Or "where is your jacket at?" just say, "where is your jacket?" Check spelling carefully. Notice words like to, and there, and there. Avoid contractions, slang, and informal language, and follow your instructor's requirements for acceptable sources. Often in a paper, particularly a literary analysis type paper, you need to have scholarly sources that come from the Alabama Virtual Library. So check the topic requirements very carefully to make sure you've met those source requirements. Scholarly sources we've talked about. Give your essay an original title. We've talked about that. When you write the title of a brief literary work, format only the title in quotation marks and capitalize the title correctly. When you write the title of a book-length literary work, italicize just that part. Refer to the author of a story or an article by the author's last name, not the author's first name. And this is just something we do in scholarship. And a lot of times I'll say, you would call William Shakespeare Shakespeare, not William. He's been dead for a long time. You didn't know him as a first name acquaintance, so refer to him by his last name. The same thing would apply to somebody like Benjamin Franklin, or even a scholar that you were studying who's still alive today. Refer to that author by last name. And one of the reasons we do that is because in the parenthetical citations in a paper and in the works cited in a paper, authors are first listed by last name. So that's just the scholarly approach that we take to naming those authors. Use present tense verbs when writing about events that occur within a story or a piece of literature. And I have some examples here, and I previously mentioned that in this handout, but this just gives some specific examples. Proofread your entire paper very carefully and look to remove those words. And those are mentioned in previous areas of the handout as well. Now, general guidelines for avoiding plagiarism. It is extremely important that you avoid plagiarism. Plagiarism means that you borrowed ideas or words from a source, but you didn't give credit to a source. You have to cite anything you originally learned from a source. It doesn't matter if that source was a person, an online source, a printed source, or some other medium. Failing to cite that information is plagiarism. So I have some examples here. Let's say in history class in 6th grade, you learned an interesting piece of information. You've remembered it ever since because it made such an impression on you. You still need to cite that to a source because it's not something you created yourself. It's not something that's popped out of your brain that you are the originator of. So if you learned something somewhere, you have to find a source to back it up. And it may not be that original source anymore because goodness knows you probably don't remember your 6th grade history book. So you want to find a source that you can support your information with. Or let's say you learned something from your grandmother. She used to be an English teacher, so she told you something about a particular author or story. You're still going to have to find a source to back that information up because that information didn't originate with you. Or if you know something because you're interested in that field, maybe you know something about medicine, or you know something about cosmetology, or you know something about welding or engineering, or you know something about nursing or veterinary science, and you know something about those things because you have an interest in that, but you originally learned it from a source. You need to find a source to back up that information when you put it in a paper. That's called responsible research. So here's what you need to test yourself with. Ask yourself, did this information originate completely with me? If the answer to that question is no, you have to provide source documentation in MLA style. What that means is you have to list a source on the works cited where that information is available, and you have to cite that information parenthetically in the body of your paper with an appropriate parenthetical citation that matches that works cited source entry. So I'm going to give you some examples, some further examples. Ask yourself, Did I learn this information somewhere at some point in time? If the answer is yes, provide a source citation. For example, let's say you remember from last semester's history class that the American Civil War began in 1861 and ended in 1865. You need to document those dates to a source. So whether that source is a book, a video, website, whatever, you need to document that information to a source. You may not still have your textbook from last semester, but you still can cite a source that you could pull those dates from. Or if you wrote in a paper that William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, or that Fraunces Tavern was the location where George Washington said farewell to his troops at the end of the American Revolution, you would need to cite that information to a source. So if you put the publication date of a story or an article, or you noted that a work of literature was very popular with readers when it was first published, you learned that somewhere. So you would have to cite that information to a source. And it may not be the source where you originally learned it, but you still can cite it to a source. You should be able to find it in a source and give credit. If you summarize the plot of a short story, which in the literary analysis paper, there may be some plot details from the short story that you summarize, then you need to cite that summarized material to the author of the story. Or if you summarize from an article, cite that material that you summarized, because even though the words may be yours, the ideas came from someone else. So just because something isn't directly quoted doesn't mean you don't have to cite it. You do. When you include dates, facts, summaries of information, details about authors' lives, information of any kind that you learned from a source, it has to be cited to a source to prevent plagiarism. And if you plagiarize in an assignment, it doesn't matter whether you did it accidentally or on purpose. You still fail that assignment. So it's super important that you give credit. Read your paper sentence by sentence. If it's an essay that requires using sources, read it sentence by sentence and ask yourself, where did I learn this? Where did I learn this? And then if you have a place where you've summarized material from an article for 2 sentences in a row, at the end of that second sentence, give credit to that article. Give credit to the author if it has one. If it's not got an author, then give credit to the article title, the way that's shown in this handout. So the Sam Student Handout ends with some examples. So here is a paragraph taken from a critical article. Here's the name of the article. It's called An Essay on a Jury of Her Peers. It's written by Lisa Ortiz. And the short story, A Jury of Her Peers, was written by Susan Glaspell. So this is the paragraph that's copied directly from Ortiz's article. And this is word for word. It talks about events that occur in the story. And then if you were writing an essay about the short story, you might read that paragraph and summarize some of the information in it in a paragraph similar to the one below. Note that the details from the short story are cited to Glaspell because she's the person who wrote the short story, not to Ortiz. Page numbers in the example below are not accurate. I just put in page numbers as placeholders to show you what the format would look like. So let's look at this paragraph. This paragraph doesn't have any quoted material, none at all, okay? Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are very disturbed about the loss of Minnie's canned goods. The student who wrote this learned that from reading the story. So since that information is available in the short story, it's cited to the author of the short story. Lisa Ortiz's article, An Essay on a Jury of Her Peers, notes that critic Linda Bensvy's interpretation of the jars is accurate. The canned fruit, much like Minnie Wright, is trapped and isolated. When the jars burst, they demonstrate Minnie's own emotional upheaval. The jars break due to freezing temperatures, like the fruit. So all of this information is taken from Ortiz's article. And technically, you wouldn't have to include Ortiz's name here, but since it's not in the exact same sentence with her name up here, I went ahead and put it in. But all of this information in this portion came from the Ortiz article on page 3. And then the fact about the 2 women being upset came from the short story on page 261. So you'll see that each parenthetical citation covers the material that comes before it. So this citation covers all of the material that comes before it. So you see, it covers most of the paragraph. It is fine to cover 2 or 3 sentences with a single citation if you're summarizing or paraphrasing. And if all of that had come from multiple pages, I could have put Ortiz 3 through 6, for example. Now, the other citation, though, covers just the material from the short story. So that material has a citation just at the end of that one sentence. And the reason it has that citation there is because this citation at the end of that sentence shows that the only thing in this paragraph that I took directly from the short story, even though I put it in my own words, is this first sentence. After that, the material came from another source. So each citation goes with the material that precedes or comes before it, not with material that follows it. And none of that's directly quoted from the article, so only directly quoted information is placed in quotation marks. If this summary had included a quoted portion, it would look like this. So I've taken pretty much the same information with the citation to the information about Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters being disturbed. And then I have continued on. The canned fruit, much like Minnie Wright, is trapped and isolated. When the jars burst, they demonstrate Minnie's own emotional upheaval. As Ortiz explains, the women's, okay, so here's my quoted portion. The women's compassion for Minnie's lost preserves is a form of sympathy or understanding for her isolated, fractured marriage. That's quoted word for word from Ortiz's article. So that part that's word for word is placed in quotation marks. And that's why it's in quotation marks, but the remainder of the paragraph is not, because the remainder of the paragraph is paraphrased or summarized. So there is an example, and I think I skipped it. Let's see. Here we go, of what not to do. So this is very important. Look at this paragraph. Here's the same general content. It's got a citation to Glassful. It has information from Ortiz, and it has that's properly cited to Ortiz. Look at the ending of this paragraph. The jars break due to the freezing temperatures. Like the fruit, Minnie has been exposed to the cold. Her relationship with her husband is cold and distant. That information came from a source. I didn't originate that off the top of my head. I learned it from reading the article. If I were to turn in a paper and I had this information at the end of a paragraph like this, or anywhere else in a paragraph for that matter, and I didn't have a parenthetical citation here at the end, then I would be plagiarizing. because it's quite obvious that I learned that information. I learned about the jars breaking. I learned about the cold relationship between Minnie and her husband from the source. So after that information, I would need a citation, or I would need to reorganize. If this information is also found on page 3, then I would move this citation down where it would cover this material. Because remember, the parenthetical citation covers what comes before it, not what follows it. So that's key information. A parenthetical citation does not cover any material that follows that parenthetical citation. So I would need to move the citation or add an additional citation if this information were on another page, or if I felt that I needed to cite it to a different source, then I would provide another citation here at the end. So that's a quick overview in multiple steps of the Sam Student Handout. And you can find detailed information about MLA style in the 9th edition of the MLA Handbook. It has examples in great detail. So if you find something that you can't figure out how to cite, or you need additional assistance with, look at your MLA handbook, or reach out to me, reach out to a member of the tutoring staff to get help, because it's better to ask than to leave off something important when it comes to documenting material in your paper. Thank you.